Hey everyone, welcome back to Gimme Growth. We're out on the growth terrace on a foggy San Francisco day with Shamanth Rao. Shamanth, we're lucky to have him join us here. He has a very colorful and impressive background in growth. I met him several years ago when Adam from Grow.co, who we've all done an interview with as well, raved about his talent. So as soon as we could, we looped him in as a 500 startup mentor, and we've been friends ever since. So Shamanth, I'll let you give the details specifically about your background with mobile, but at a high level, he's behind two exits. The first was Bingo Bash, and the second was Puzzle Social to Zynga recently. And lots of growth people are caught up in talking about things that sound really good, but what I love about Shamanth is that every day he's very much in the details and he really knows what he's talking about. So we're lucky to have him here with us today, and we have some questions. So Shamanth, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Tom. Very excited to join you on the Gimme Growth program. So I have so much respect for you, everything you've accomplished. So very honored to be out here and to be able to share some of what I have learned and seen over the years.
Great, perfect. Yeah, well, why don't you tell us a little bit about both of the companies, the most two recent companies that were acquired, and some of those stories really quick so people know a little bit more about your background.
Sure. The most recent acquisition I was a part of, like I'm still there, this is Puzzle Social. We make an app called Daily Celebrity Crossword, which is a daily crossword game. And just to give you context, we outgrows the New York Times crossword, which is a far better known brand than us, very, very significantly, at least 2 or 3x. We grew 7x over the last year and a half. So that's something we've been very, very proud of accomplishing. Prior to that, I was at Dash Gaming. That's its biggest app. It's called Bingo Bash, again acquired by GSM Games, a significant figure. Within the top 10 grossing apps for the longest time, one of Apple's top 10 apps for iPad, both 2013 and 2014. So I have been very grateful for having had the chance to work on some of the projects that I've been a part of.
Yeah, most definitely. And how did you get into growth in the first place as your career progressed?
Sure. I actually got into growth by way of search marketing. I used to run a Google AdWords marketing agency in small town India. We would pitch to very small resorts in small town India. And this was at a time when people didn't quite understand internet, leave alone search engine marketing in India. So I would, walk into meetings and they would ask, okay, what is Google search? This experience of selling to very skeptical businesses and delivering on very tight commitments, because these were small resorts. These had like 10, 15 rooms and were operating on $200, $300 budgets a month. This experience gave me very thick skin, obviously, but it also gave me the sensibility that all growth has to be financially responsible. It gave me the sensibility that all growth has to be long-term focused, right? And something I've carried on to a lot of my subsequent experiences. Once I moved out here, started working with Bingo Bash and now with Puzzle Social, just this mentality of having all growth be financially responsible and long-term focused. That's something that has served me all through.
Got it. Okay, cool. And so, outside of that, what are some of the biggest challenges that you face on a day-to-day basis while growing apps? What are some of the things that keep you up at night?
Yeah, where I'm right now, there's two huge challenges that I constantly think about. The first one is execution primarily, because a huge part of what I do is following through executing, doing the very unsexy work of wrangling spreadsheets, monitoring our metrics, making sure the trains run on time, so to speak. Right? And the other thing that does keep me up is thinking about new channels and platforms. Uh, we, I've, I do want to be first off the blocks when it comes to the newer platforms like like iMessage, Snapchat, Pinterest, Facebook Messenger. They're all coming up, and I constantly think about how to leverage these first up. And just the context, the advertisers who were first off the blocks when Google AdWords was taking off and Facebook was taking off reaped huge dividends and this enormous payoff to be able to having that first mover advantage on a platform. And so that's something I think constantly about.
Got it. How do you actually like keep an eye out for that? Is it just a matter of like being a member of groups, looking at what other people are doing? Any secrets or I know secrets is not a good word, but any advice for people in the audience as to like where to watch for those first mover types of opportunities?
I would suggest looking at any new platform in terms of the size of the audience and how open the platform itself is in terms of allowing a product such as yours.
Mm-hmm.
To take an example, you see iMessage. iMessage has 500,000 very active users at the very least, and they have made it a priority for themselves to open themselves up to games lately, games and stickers. So when I would look at iMessage, I would say, all right, this could be a huge platform, and at the very least worth testing.
Yeah, I think another good one that I forget who it was who recommended, but even if you're not a technical person, you can always read the API docs. And even without understanding much about software, you can understand basically what you're able to do and what you're not able to do. And that can give you good ideas.
Exactly.
So, yeah, let me flip back to my notes. So, the last kind of like theoretical question I want to ask you before getting down into more specific parts of the growth funnel are how did you know to join the two companies that you joined? Because at some point, some of the companies in the batch are going to want to hire somebody like yourself. And what is it that made these companies solid decisions for you?
Yes, that's a great question because, a growth leader can make a huge difference to a startup. And
oh,
very crucial.
Hey, it's a little harder to hear you. Yeah, that's right.
I'm gonna go again. Yeah. I can definitely. Yeah, that's a great question because a growth leader can be a very crucial early hire. And as for me, I look for three primary criteria while assessing possible companies that I could partner with, that I could join. One, they have a strong core business with a product that has some very strong usage, a distinctive value proposition. Next is they're financially stable. And that's something you sort of hear me talk about a lot in terms of all businesses having to be financially viable and stable. And the next is significant upside potential. With these three criteria, the big metaphor I like to think of is this. As a growth leader, your job has to be to pour gasoline on fire. If there is no fire in the first place, you're not going to be able to make a difference as a growth leader. So if you're a business owner or a startup founder, your job has to be to build a substantial enough fire that a growth leader can come and amplify and turn into a conflagration. That's how I like to think about bringing in a growth hire.
Okay. So they have to have everything basically ready to pour gasoline on the fire. The fire already has to be going.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
Great. Well, so then getting into more details around actual growth, when you go into a company, these questions are first broken down into two parts of the funnel, retention and acquisition. But when you go into a company, how do you know what to focus on first? And how do you make up your mind to attack that certain part of the funnel?
Sure. And I can see that can be a challenge just because there's just so many metrics to focus on, right? Which one do you move first? And that's such a huge challenge for so many companies, for so many businesses. We start with a growth model That's how I like to start looking at any business, any company that I'm a part of, which essentially is an Excel model that accounts for all the variables that we can move and all the outcomes that we're seeking, right? So this is like a living, breathing document that we reference every single day in our company. So variables we could move could be new installs, retention, key factors, R2, up-down. Outcomes could be DAU, revenue, profits. So to answer your question, how do we pick the right part of the funnel to attack? I look at our growth model and understand which variables have the highest potential for moving the needle. I know some of this can sound very abstract and high level, so let me give you an example of what all of this looks like around that.
Great.
Right. So for instance, we looked at our growth model as a hypothetical example, and we said, okay, if we improve our day 7 retention by 5%, we actually plug that increased 5% in our growth model and say, okay, if we do this, what our DAU will jump by 50K, our revenue will increase by 100K, profitability by 20K. That's the quantitative piece of it. And then we're like, okay, we know that it takes a 5% increase in day 7 retention. How do we execute this 5% increase? What can we improve our onboarding experience? Can we include a starter pack? We then build qualitative hypothesis, and then we implement these in order to hit very specific goals that are in our growth model.
Okay, cool. Are there any other tools that you like to use specifically to track retention? I know that you've talked a lot about cohort models and stuff like that. What are some of your favorites?
Yeah, I like to say the tools don't matter nearly as much, as long as you track the retention. And I say that because I know a lot of your listeners are going to be early stage startups without necessarily the bandwidth to look at super elaborate, complicated tools. So my advice to most early stage startups is just get started. Flurry has free analytics where you can track retention for free. That's just a great starting point because you start to measure something at the very least.
Okay. So don't get too complicated. Even using Excel or something like that is okay.
Yeah, absolutely. If you're like a B2B enterprise company, you don't have that many data points. You might as well just use Excel.
Yeah, of course, definitely. Well, so let's say that you have to focus on retention, right? What are some of the specific things that you can do? Not necessarily the tactics that you've done for your particular companies, but what are some of the different questions that you might ask yourself and the mindset that you might try to get in to try and decide what to do and what might be most impactful? Like you mentioned, those like quantitative hypotheses. How do you come up with some of those things?
Yeah, I break down retention into 3 components. And in order to understand at a more granular level what has the most potential to be improved. Right. The first one is new user retention or upstream retention. This is a measure of whether your users really get your product, whether they see enough value in it. Right. And this has to do with how well you're onboarding them, how well you get them to understand the product, and how quickly you give them a win moment or an achievement moment so they say, aha, I can use the product. The second component is the current user retention, which I think of more as the core health of the product, which means if users are using your product, are they continuing to use it? Right? If your Facebook, you logged in the last 25 days, are you going to continue using it on day 26? If you aren't, the issue often is technical, right? Because if you just drop off on day 26, your server is probably down. And this is a useful checkpoint to understand if your product or game is behaving the way you expect it to be.
Okay.
And if it is actually strong enough of a habit as you intend it to be, right? And the third component I look at is returning user retention, which is if your users left the app or your product, and how effectively are you bringing them back?
Okay.
And you can impact this component of your retention through push notifications, resurrection emails, right? And sort of reaffirming the value of your product to people who have just dropped out. So those are the three components I look at when I sort of think of retention. But fundamentally, at a high level, the single most important question I ask myself is, how do I optimize for super long-term retention? Something I attribute a lot of the success to is the fact that we've thought about our day 365 retention, or day 730 retention.
Okay.
Right? And here's the simple idea: if you can bring your users back 1 year after they've installed, 2 years after they've installed, and you optimize for that, you pretty much win. Because hardly anyone thinks about or builds a growth structure around the very, very long term.
Yeah, most definitely. That's very true. What may I ask you specifically, what are some of the tactics that you've done to drive more retention? And this is really more just to kind of like get the mind going for founders, not specifically to like copy these things, but it's always fun to hear some of the things that have worked, some of the wins that might be parlayed over.
Sure. The tactics themselves depend on the goals that you're trying to hit. So I imagine kind of varies from, depending on the product you're trying to grow and the metrics you're trying to impact. But I will give you an example just of something we accomplished that I'm very proud of, that can illustrate our thinking process, just behind the tactic. So what we did some time ago was give away our daily puzzles for free. As background, in the past, when users would come into our game, we would charge them. Hang on, just give me.
Yeah.
So in the past, when users would install our app, they would get a certain number of coins to play puzzles with. When they would run out of coins, they would have to make in-app purchases, right? At which point they would just get the hell out of the app and never play again.
Mm-hmm.
And the way we chose to combat that was to say, okay, what if we gave our daily puzzles for free? We would give up a monetization lever. We would give up the money we're making because we would give up some of the money we're making because people are paying for this puzzle. But because it's free, so many of them would come back that we would recoup that money we've lost through in-app advertising.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the trade-off we made. And we found, because we had modeled this out, we found that the moment we removed the barrier to playing the daily puzzle and made it free, our retention went through the roof. Revenues went through the roof. So to step back and to answer your question direct, at a high level, the tactic that worked for us was to sacrifice monetization for retention.
Mm-hmm.
And at a high level, the question you want to ask yourself is, okay, if I want to improve my retention, what do I sacrifice to get it?
Okay, I like that. Yep, that's very useful. It's also a great story. I love the daily puzzle one. For companies that don't yet have a whole lot of retention data to measure, like for example, they can't ever see 365-day retention because they've really only been alive for 30, 45, 50 days. What are some of the things that you would look at if you were working in a company that nascent?
Yeah, I advise companies that without a lot of data to still look at what they have, because even if you have a day 7 or a day 14 retention curve, you can extrapolate it using a power function to get a day 365 assumed retention. And just my advice is that an assumed retention is better than no retention number to track with and optimize on a base start.
Okay, cool. Sounds good. So just use the data you have and try to extrapolate and make hypotheses off of that.
Yeah, and it does not require elaborate coding. You can build a power function inside of Excel in a couple of minutes with 5 data points.
Yep, just Google how to do that.
And that's something we've had to do multiple times as we've changed our own business model. And we've found that our existing retention curve is no longer valid.
Okay, well, that's good to know. Yeah, things always change.
Yeah.
So switching over to acquisition,
yeah.
How have you picked some of your first acquisition channels? Because like that's oftentimes like one of the most challenging things is there's so many places that you can go out to acquire users, whether it be paid or whether it be organic, and even within each of those, like it's very challenging to figure out what to do first. What are some of the ways that you think about executing or finding the new acquisition channels or power acquisition channels, I should say?
Sure. So I'll preface my answer by saying that most businesses I've been involved in have relied on paid acquisition.
Mm-hmm.
And I would also add that for a business to truly scale substantially, there has to be some element of paid acquisition because it's a veritable ocean out there. So even though for most startups, paid acquisition can be a dirty word, it's also a signal that you've nailed your economics. So with that preface, I would say that the first acquisition channel for most businesses that I would recommend would be Google search and Facebook ads. And this is because your first acquisition channels should give you high quality users who love your product. And almost invariably, these are the two best sources you can think of. Google search, because it's very intent driven, which means if you have HR payroll software, they're searching for HR payroll software, they come to you, boom, got to be a good user. With Facebook, I specifically recommend starting with a 1% lookalike of your best users. So Facebook's rolling with people who look absolutely like the top 1 percentile of your best possible users. Naturally, you end up with the best possible users as you pick your first acquisition channel.
Got it. Okay, cool. And if you were looking to do stuff outside of paid, do you have any recommendations for mobile companies on some different organic channels that they might look towards?
Sure. For many startups, massive paid budgets aren't realistic, especially when they're starting out of the gate. So they absolutely have to look at other channels. Some channels that could work would be partnerships and integrations. So and again, this ties into my earlier answer about getting onto new channels.
Mm-hmm.
You're first off the gate on iMessage, on Snapchat, on a platform that just starts emerging. You don't necessarily need massive paid budgets. The other strategy that would make sense would be enterprise sales. You can get some big ass enterprise customer that gets you enough traction right out of the gate. Something else that can work when you're a consumer-facing product could be content marketing. You're getting content about your product out in online, places where your users hang out, right? And I feel a lot of CRM companies, a lot of analytics companies do a very, very good job of this content marketing. Although ultimately, I would say you have to do what's right for your product, whether it's paid or unpaid. Because even if you go for unpaid channels like these, they come with a cost associated.
Yeah. Everybody forgets that.
Exactly. There is an opportunity cost to unpaid marketing.
Yeah, 100%. What are your thoughts on incentivizing installs?
They're terrible.
They're terrible. Okay, cool.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
yeah, enough said.
Yeah, I'm just going to say, yeah, here's why it's terrible. Because yes, of course it's dirt cheap, but you're getting shitty users for dirt cheap prices. You're bringing in users who have no motivation to use your product. That's because they're cheap, and they will not use your product just because they're coming in because they have an incentive in some other product, right? So yeah, I've never seen this work. I will add the caveat that the only time incentivized traffic can work is if you want to be in the top 10 ranks and you want to drive a lot of organic installs as a result of being in the top 10 ranks. And you already have a substantial number of non-incentivized installs coming your way. You want to, and you say, okay, if only I had like 5,000 more installs, I would go from number 12 to number 9. That's probably when it would make sense. And I would also add that when I say top 10, I mean overall top 10 in the app stores, not like in a specific category or a subcategory, because that's barely most either.
That's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So that would take massive budgets, six-figure budgets on very unpredictable outcomes. It's something that I don't recommend for nearly every company out there.
Got it. Okay, cool. So when it comes to paid outside of Facebook and Google, the mobile ad networks are just generally speaking really confusing, and there's so many of them, and like it's a hard thing to navigate. Do you have any advice to people who are working in trying to use these mobile ad networks, or do you advise sticking away from them in the beginning? What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. Before my advice usually is to build in an LTV model before you start to expand and diversify and scale your channel. Because once you have an LTV model, you can be very network agnostic. If it hits your LTV targets, you're in. If it doesn't, you drop it. It's as simple as that. With that background, I also, when I sort of evaluate networks, but test them, I try and make sure I have a mix of ad formats. I make sure I cover all my basic sets of ad formats: video, banners, interstitials, playables. I try and make sure I cover those bases to make sure I capture enough of a footprint. I also try and I also make sure I run only non-incentivized, and if there are networks that optimize for performance using post-install events. So, for instance, there are networks that say, okay, you can pay me a cost per purchaser. There are networks that say, okay, you send me your purchase data, we will optimize for your cost per purchase, even though you pay for install. I lean toward networks like that that tend to be much more responsible and accountable.
Okay, great. I'll get a list of those from you probably later, and I'll put them into the footnotes if that's cool. Yeah. And then how do you, kind of the last question is around activation and mobile web. What do you do specifically with mobile web? Is there anything what kind of a role does that play in helping activate people or helping with acquisition and potentially like reducing the friction for people who don't want to necessarily download something? Do you have any good tips or advice around how to incorporate mobile web into your mobile app strategy?
Mobile web is not a part of my strategy, has not been a part of my strategy so far. And this is because I find there's just so much in-app traffic. I haven't bothered to look at the mobile web, even though I've had a couple of opportunities to do exactly that. So your audience, which I imagine consists of a lot of relatively early stage startups, I would advise them not to really look at mobile web at all, simply because the ocean of in-app traffic, in-app users is so huge. Why
Okay.
pick a channel that has an additional layer of friction associated with it, unless you have a strong hypothesis for why your users hang out on the mobile web and nowhere else?
Okay. Cool. That's good to know. That's good feedback. That's pretty much all of my questions. This has been really helpful. I think that the people who are in the course who are focused on mobile apps and even non-mobile apps are going to love this. So thank you so much for joining us and for doing this.
Awesome, Dom. Always an honor to be a part of your program. Excited to be here. Thank you so much for having
Cool.
me.
I'm going to stop recording, but don't hang up. Don't hang up yet. Okay.
Awesome.